buy cars. It goes back to a notion that Henry Ford had that, he wanted to produce a car that workers could buy. And what many of the auto workers are saying today is that they're producing cars they can't afford to buy.
Dr. Masters, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's begin our talk with some basics here. When was the UAW founded?
It was founded in the mid-1930s, although there were efforts to form unions among auto workers before that. But officially, its first constitutional convention was held in 1936. And it had a very turbulent beginning in which it went through several gyrations, first affiliating with the AFL-CIO, then the CIO, and going through a period of intense factionalism in which there were essentially competing groups vying almost violently for power within the UAW until the late
Violently? Oh, wow. Okay.
Until almost the late 1940s when Walter Reuther. I mean by violently, they were very heated exchanges. There were parties, groups that had very profound differences with each other. There were socialist groups, there were communist groups, there were more craft union oriented types of groups within the struggle. But it took a while to sort out, and all this was coterminous when the union was fighting with the companies for recognition.
And all of this, when you say 1936, this is in the later years, 6-7 years into the Great Depression, and FDR is the president. Yeah. Did that inform and guide any of their activities?
Oh, certainly it did. I think, as a result of the Great Depression and Roosevelt's election, you had a turnaround in public policy towards unions.
Yeah.
And there were laws enacted which favored the organizing of unions. And that really, I think, gave momentum to the labor movement, which had begun already in response to the Great Recession and fear that workers were really being left behind and neglected, and their wages had gone down. Employment levels were still very low, relatively speaking, at that time, and
of course, yeah.
people were struggling to make ends meet in a very basic sense. And as an aside, I remember very much my grandparents who lived through the Great Depression talking about the hardship that they went through and how they lost their jobs and how they had to go live with their parents and survive by that way, which was a less than ideal circumstances for newlyweds at that time. But it rendered a lot of hardship on people. And so they struggled. And it really wasn't until World War II and the mobilization of the economy that we fully recovered from the Great Depression.
Did your grandparents work in the auto industry by any chance?
No. My grandfather was a baseball player, a minor league baseball player.
Oh, that's great.
Did odds and ends to make ends meet at that point in time. And then he couldn't get a job during the Depression years. And my grandmother actually was for that generation, she was college educated.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a big deal.
She did not go to work right away, but later on, toward the very end of the Depression, she got a job teaching in a school district and was able to make ends by that. My grandfather got a job as a clerk for the railroad industry. Yeah, the Illinois Central. And that job, I'll tell you, he was so proud of that job. When he retired, he got free rides for the rest of his life.
Oh, wonderful.
He took advantage of them.
Did you ever go on those free rides?
I never got to go with him on it, but he used to come and visit us. He lived in Illinois. We lived then in Pennsylvania, and he used to take the train from I think Carbondale, Illinois to Altoona, Pennsylvania.
Wonderful. That's a great story and a nice digression. Let's get back to UAW, and you intrigue me by this timeline, Dr. Masters. Formally the Constitution, their internal Constitution was in 1936, and it took way into the 40s for them to fully materialize into a union as we know it. Did World War II delay any of this activity? Like, the sense of patriotism, don't unionize, all efforts go towards the war.
Well, I don't think it delayed union activity. I think what it did is refocus it. Um, the
Refocused it. Okay.
the UAW grew dramatically after they won recognition from General Motors and Ford Motor Company. And so before actually the start of our involvement in World War II, they had grown to a significant size, about maybe 500,000 members from just
Wow.
about 30,000 when they originally formed, as really as a collection of local unions in the mid 1930s. They were formed really by aggregating these local unions together under one umbrella. And that's one of the reasons why they had so many competing different factions, because they were pre-existing to the formation of the union.
Oh,
Uh,
that's
but
interesting. Okay.
but during World War II, there were all kinds of war stabilization boards, which really put a stop to strikes for the war effort. But the union benefited because, everybody's heard the phrase now, the arsenal of democracy. They were
Yeah.
really the arsenal of democracy. And so the auto companies really became the producers for the war machine, if you will. And the employment that resulted from that, the massive government contracts that they received, and the jobs that were produced as a result of that, led to the growth in the United Auto Workers. And at the end of World War II, there were pent up frustrations because of wage price controls and rationing. Workers wanted to catch up with their
Yeah.
wages. And there was also concern during the transition, the demilitarization period in which so many people were, not producing the war machine anymore and coming back from military service, going back into the civilian workforce. They had to find a place for them. And there was a period of really, I think, um, intensive strike activity. And the UAW had a major strike in the 1945, 1946 region, in which it demanded 30% wage hikes. And it was during that time period, I would think from the mid 1940s through the mid 1970s, that the UAW's relationship with the auto companies, I would characterize it as being predictably adversarial.
Predictably adversarial. Oh, interesting.
That they struck every year one of the major auto companies between 1950 and 1976.
1950 to 1976? That's a
Every
lot of striking.
every 3 years. And that's just where they would strike one. In one year, in 1955, they struck two at the same time, but one of them was only for one day. But Ruther established in the early 50s this idea of targeting a company and then trying to negotiate a contract with that company as a basis for taking to the other two to establish a pattern in the industry.
Um, this is really fascinating. One strike a year almost from 1950 to 1976. In one case, two strikes. Um, for us to talk about this would take hours and hours, a couple of more
Yeah, yeah.
podcasts. What I'm interested in, just generally speaking, do you think UAW's platform has drastically changed since this period? And it's kind of a tough question because the period itself stretches over 30 years. So is this the same UAW now?
Well, let me pinpoint a time period during that era that I think resembles where we are now. And I think actually
Okay.
the UAW of today, under the leadership of Sean Fain, which really led an insurgent group to the helm in the recent elections that were held due to the scandal. It tore a page from Walter Reuther's book. And that isn't a criticism. That's just, I think they realized that it was a wonderful page to replicate and that they have a more militant view. I would say it's quasi-socialistic. It's not blatantly socialistic, but it's the recognition that workers are entitled to their rightful share of profits. And Walter Reuther had an interesting way of phrasing it. I thought was he said that the challenge before labor and business is to find a way to uh, share the our equities between labor, business, that is the shareholders and customers in the abundance of corporations.
In the
And
abundance of corporations. Okay.
yeah, and that meant more than just necessarily their profits, also their revenues and their infrastructure, if you will. But I think that it's a realization that, Ruther said that they shouldn't have to depend on the muscle of collective bargaining to get their fair share. But that was an unfortunate
How,
reality.
how how else would they do it if they didn't
Well, I think
depend?
I think you were hoping for some sort of, if not government mandate or policy that would encourage that,
I see.
perhaps a progressive industrial policy, but more likely some sort of compact between the companies and the unions that would say labor's entitled to a certain share and that we ought to be willing to treat them like we do other equity partners.
So was this, you said you're gonna focus, you're gonna point us to a earlier period in UAW's history.
This was the period in the, I would say, between really 1950 and 1960 when Walter Reuther ran the UAW, in which he made this case in which he was able to secure the contracts that got the benefits that were precedent setting in uh, American labor to provide for pensions, to provide for health care, to provide for cost of living allowances and other things, and to also tie wage increases to productivity increases. Ruther didn't really believe that you got anything unless you gave something. And he knew that they wanted to be able to give the companies a reason to raise their prices so that they could generate more profits. And he felt that that was being more productive as workers. And
Oh, raise prices,
produce
more
more,
revenue, more to share.
they could produce more for less money. And therefore, they didn't have to pass the increase of wages on fully, but they could pass some of them on. And still be able to sell their cars because workers' standard of living were going up as a result of the wage increases, and they were able to buy cars. It goes back to a notion that Henry Ford had that he wanted to produce a car that workers could buy. And what many of the auto workers are saying today is that they're producing cars they can't afford to buy.
Interesting, which is different than what Henry Ford had suggested. Now, going back to this period, 1950 to 61, Walter Reuther, and then also other strikes that you were talking about. Again, without getting into each one of them individually, I'm just wondering what compels the UAW's leadership to call a strike. It's a big deal. Is it just being at loggerheads? Is it some of the stuff that you were sharing, internal strife, like factional issues within? Is it the political climate?
I would say that it boiled down to that they felt the continual need to keep the pressure on the companies. That if they didn't pressure the companies continually, that they would not give them what they felt they could get and what they were capable of giving. And that therefore they knew that one of the ways they could clearly get their attention was by striking them. And that was probably the quickest way they could get to getting what they wanted. And otherwise, they were going to be complacent and lackadaisical, and you couldn't force them into um, sharing their wealth, so to speak. It's also important to remember during this time period the dominant position that the Detroit Three, the major auto companies, had. They monopolized the market, literally speaking. In 1965, the big three, so to speak, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, they controlled over 90% of the market share of vehicle sales in the US.
Wow.
Now it's just a little bit over 40%.
So back then there was less pressure for them.
Yeah, I mean they were literally an oligopoly, and they could pass along price increases. I won't say they colluded, but didn't take much rocket science to figure out what everybody else was doing when there are only three of you. And you
Yeah.
basically produce the same product and the same costs. You buy the same materials from the same suppliers, and you know how to play the game. But I think that was the reality that they were in, and they got into a ritualistic pattern. And also, I think it's important to remember there were lots of strikes during this time period in the broader transportation equipment industry, agricultural equipment, aerospace equipment, trucking, those kinds of things. There were lots of strikes in that broader industry. And there were a fair number of not only authorized strikes, that is, those sanctioned by the union, but wildcat strikes in which locals went out and strike. And when I recounted that incidence of strikes every 3 years, I am not including the number of local strikes because it's important to remember when the UAW negotiates its contracts, it's now every 4 years. It also is negotiating all its local contracts.
Hmm.
So under each of these companies, it has a number of local agreements which deal with things such as plant conditions, job classifications, scheduling at the plants, those kinds of things. They have their own agreements on those terms, but they don't tie their local agreements to their national agreement. So
You mean
that,
the terms of local agreements may be different?
well, you don't have to approve them all at once. So, for example, like if you're in the Teamsters, when they negotiate their national agreement, like they did recently with UPS, they also will negotiate local agreements. But for their national agreement to take effect, all their local agreements have to be negotiated and approved as well. But you
Okay.
don't have to have that in the auto industry. So what would often happen is that you would have the national agreement being reached, but many locals not being able to reach agreement, and there being strike at the local levels. So there were strikes at the local levels, and then there was a period of time in which it was not uncommon for there to be lots of what we call wildcat or
Yeah.
illegal strikes. They're unauthorized by the union, but a group of people at a local level just decide for whatever reason they're going out on strike, and that can be very disruptive.
And when you say illegal, illegal per the union's rules, right?
Per the National Labor Relations Act,
Yeah.
and also they're not sanctioned by the union. The union doesn't condone wildcat strikes. It only wants strikes to occur with their approval. So if you're a local union, you want to go out on strike in the UAW, you have to get the approval of the national union.
I see. Is it my perception, or did strikes and union heft in the automobile industry sort of wane or perhaps not be in the news media for several decades?
Dramatically.
Dramatically. Okay, so I'm not misperceiving.
Yes, yes. So in after 1976, you had a strike in 1983. Then you had a strike in 2007 and 2019. These are national strikes.
Oh, these are far fewer than before.
Yes, and then you had over a period of, I'd say 30 years, the past 30 years, you've had maybe uh, 50 strikes uh, at the local and national level against GM and Chrysler. You haven't had any against Ford.
I see. But it surely is less, doesn't dominate the news as much as I used to.
No, strike activity in the U.S. in general across all industries, manufacturing, auto manufacturing, and everything but the public sector has fallen precipitously. So, up until, even this year, when there's all the talk about these plentiful strikes, there have only been 18 new strikes involving a little bit over 300,000 workers. And that's of a workforce of more than 160 million.
Wow. Wow, that is fewer. All right. Well, let's take a break here and we'll be back to talk about union scandals and financing.